Welcome to the Business Trendsetter Podcast, where we talk about trends and how to use them to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan, and today we've got a special guest, Brandon Wilson from STEADYNAMIC, who is going to talk a little bit about some interesting things in his expertise in his domain. So, Brandon, welcome to the show. Give us a quick introduction of your background.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Manny. So STEADYNAMIC, we are at our core a custom software development consultancy and development agency. So we build bespoke custom software applications for our clients. That is sometimes a web and mobile app. That is sometimes an internal business process related app. And most recently does contemplate AI, obviously all the rage, but where people are looking to harvest and harness all of the promise of how AI might help either bring efficiency or enrichment to some component of their business via, the use of software to deliver it.
What's interesting is you and I met in person, I think last week, and we had a very good conversation. We talked about probably about 10 different things. And what was interesting about the activity and the sort of sense of our conversation that I only have a peek of it from the early days of the .com era, when so many things were happening at so many different connections and speeds. And I think a lot of that's happening now with respect to AI. And you and I also talked about how AI, there's the AI component, and there's also just good old fashioned technology as well. And sometimes one is mistaken for the other. And so what is your take on that between what AI is and what a software or automation technology is?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unequivocally, the answer is AI is not necessarily the solution to every problem. And in some cases, not even required to accomplish certain tasks. And then you might even break that up into most recently what I think most people refer to kind of blanketly as like AI might be generative AI, but there's still clearly classic AI, right? Prediction, recommendation, et cetera. And so, but I think all of the information that's being shared about AI and how it might be applied is it's a bit of a blessing and a curse, and I think there's definitely noise in the system. And I think that actually to some degree it slows people's decision making down because they can't sort through the noise. They know there's something there. They know there's a promise of it being utilized to help achieve their goals. They don't totally understand where it fits. And frankly, they need to rely on people with expertise to help them sort that out. So we do spend a fair amount of what, I mentioned we're both a consultancy and development agency. We spend a fair amount of time on the front end as consultants to help people figure that out, where it fits, does it fit, and where it fits in order to help them achieve their goals.
Very interesting. So you've been at this for a while. And we oftentimes don't, as business leaders and people in the position that our listeners and viewers are in, typically, they don't really have an idea on how the sausage is made, right? They use a software tool. You and I were talking earlier today about a piece of software that I use called Shift. It's an email client that aggregates a bunch of my emails, and it works, 99% of the time. But when it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And, I have no idea how to fix that or why it's breaking. And certainly you at the helm of a company as CEO and managing, 85 plus developers across, the two continents and all this. Tell us, give us an idea from your perspective, kind of two questions. The first of which is, how has the market changed, the software development market, if you will, changed since you've been doing it? That's the first question. And then the second question is, how can a business leader, our listeners are typically business leaders and they're either business owners or they've got an executive title. How can they harness the power of what you do to really extend and take their value to the next level?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. And, I guess my immediate response is, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And frankly, in this case, is really applicable. And what I mean is, we specifically my firm, but I think in general advice is anybody that's talking to you about technology first, you should stay away from. So what I mean is, and the part that stays the same is diagnosing or planning, diagnosing a problem and planning and proposing a solution starts with what the client's needs are, who the users of that technology are, they internal or external users, what are the value you're trying to add, what pain points and problems are you trying to solve, and ultimately that front end discovery process is for the purpose of getting really clear requirements developed around how we're going to help you tackle a problem. And then and only then do you start talking about which and what technologies will help you achieve that goal. And so I think this is now even maybe more important from an AI perspective, as AI is now hot on everyone's mind, because one thing I see in the marketplace is a lot of AI tools are being presented as being self-service. And what I mean is, hey, connect a couple databases, wire it up, do an integration, connect it to your CRM and whiz bang bam, now you're off to the races. And I think that is generally not a very accurate portrayal of how easy it is, and maybe further, the quality or accuracy of the results of a lot of these platforms, I think, have left a fair amount of people underwhelmed. And and, and maybe it's I would applaud anybody to be exploring, conducting research, even trialing or piloting certain technologies in order to kind of learn what may or may not fit. But unless you have, and I think you mentioned it before, this is kind of coming back to answer your question about the explainability. There's kind of two parts of explainable AI, which is a very kind of being broadly adopted from an industry perspective as an important principle in AI solutions, and that is explainability of what the AI actually does. We don't want black box AIs. No one really knows how it's performing, what it's doing, what the underlying algorithms are, how they're designed, and kind of effectively unleashing them without understanding exactly how they're performing and what they're supposed to perform and what the expected results are. That's the really at the kind of underlying like algorithmic layer. But how it gets implemented when connecting the dots across multiple systems, maybe your database and then maybe your ERP system, your CRMs, you start to look at all of the different, business tools a business might use. That can be a very complex implementation, even if all you're trying to do is accomplish a small function. And so I think here again, I again applaud anybody who is experimenting. I think that is the right decision at this point. In fact, I would compel kind of any business owner or executive to be embracing this, at least from a perspective of learning where it fits, because the bottom line is, and we've seen in just a short amount of time, the technology is getting better, faster, cheaper, literally by the month. Which goes back to the blessing and the curse. There's constant change in this marketplace right now, and so you could end up spending to build and deploy a solution that then 6 months from now might need to be retooled. Frankly, might even need to be scrapped. And so there has to be a preparedness for some of these, call it unfortunate or unintended consequences of going down this path. But I believe everybody should be embracing it, exploring it, and building on it. I think it's going to be, just as you started that question, ubiquitous, like what happened when the .com boom happened. Okay, there was a big peak, then there was a bit of a washout, but look where we are now.
Right. I think what's interesting about the meeting that we had, and then this some of the nature of this conversation we're having, is the idea of business owners really have to extend their offerings. At Spark Partners, we talk a lot about trends. We also talk about how many companies need to become media companies, whether they like it or not. If they don't know, if their customers don't know about them, they're almost useless, right? And not to say that word of mouth and traditional marketing efforts are gone, because they're still strong, but there's now a new level of conversation that needs to happen between the provider of the value and the consumer of the value. And this is why we do this podcast. Really, we have our own consultancy. I run a company, another company, and all of that needs to have the awareness and the marketing vehicle that we're using. In this case, is a podcast. We also do a lot of social media channels and LinkedIn and Instagram and YouTube. All those collectively are the mouthpiece that we have to send out the message that we have to our customers. Now, another thing we talk about, and this is where I think the real meat and potatoes of this conversation is going to come into play, is the idea of what a company's value is and how they can really extend it or transform it or transmute it into something else. In this particular case, into an app. And now this is why your expertise is so interesting, because not a lot of people understand this. And I think that this podcast in particular can be that mouthpiece for you to showcase what you do and why you think it's important for small and medium-sized business owners to extend their value using an app or some web platform. So
Right.
let's get to the meat and potatoes here, Brandon.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Before I jump onto that topic, but I think you raised something which is a good example, maybe kind of sets the tone for how this technology, meaning AI, brings additional features and capabilities to the example you gave. For instance, marketing or content creation. So, you listed a number of platforms. You do a podcast and you do subsequent content that supports the podcast and make that available to your subscribers. Well, what AI does, and you can consider, there's a feature you can add on top of all of that content to make it accessible in a new way that wasn't possible, not that long ago. And what I mean is, you can make it searchable, you can make it interactive now. So you've built this giant body of content. That's video, it's audio, it's text, and the way it's delivered today, yes, it's interactive in a sense that there's video, but the person doesn't actually interact with it. And so, having AI tools, specifically using LLMs like ChatGPT, to have conversations with the content that you've created is like a really good example and use case. And I think is now starting to, again, add features to, existing, strategy and implementation of content, where you've now got a new tool in the toolkit, right? So there's just a good example.
That's a really good point, and I think you're right. I think it would be a really good example for the second half of that conversation, to give a real world example. So, say for instance, Spark Partners, we have almost 200, or we might have passed 200 podcasts already. Each podcast is approximately 30 minutes. In addition to the podcast, we also have a kind of a summary, a write up, and some questions that listeners and viewers can reference. And there's a lot of data there, right? We've got a lot of content. How would you approach that project so that the consumers of the Spark Partners Business Trendsetter podcast can have access to the AI avatar of the podcast? Walk us through that, and then we'll dovetail into the second part of the question.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So you rightfully describe that content library as a database. And so from an AI perspective or generative AI perspective, using LLMs, we take that database and make it accessible to the LLM. So basically what you're doing is there's a technique in generative AI called RAG. It's a retrieval augmented generation. So effectively, we take all that content as a database and we load it into a specific repository where it can be accessed and the LLM can talk to it. Now, a use case might look like that chatbot on your site with all your content, like you list your past episodes and like access to all the links of ways that someone could access your content, whether it's videos, documents, podcasts, etc. And we have a chat interface where a user might say, as an example, a use case might say, "Oh, I really enjoyed Manny's most recent podcast on this topic. What other podcast has Manny done where this topic was discussed?" Right? That becomes their question. And so from a database perspective, we've taken all of your content and we've basically timestamped it and given it a location, and can answer that question by saying, here's a list of the other 3 podcasts that Manny did that talked about this subject.
Wow.
here's a link with the timestamp. And then we've even, for one particular client, we even presented a picture of the video clip and identified the exact timestamp of both the beginning and end of when that topic was discussed so that they could go and then interact with it, right? So alternatively, the way someone might do that today, well, actually, I'm not even really sure how they would do it today, other than they would have to use keyword search or metadata to understand what was in a podcast or a YouTube video, but they'd still have to scroll through it to find where that content, the exact content, that piece of content they wanted to hear lived. And so what this does is gives them access to everything you've ever created. It allows them to ask questions about it, when it existed. And then from there, the way, using ChatGPT, you could start to conceive of a scenario where you can have a chat with Manny's content, which is getting similar to having a chat with Manny, right? Because it understands all the things you've ever talked about. Well, I shouldn't say understand. It knows where all your content is, how you presented it, who you are, what topics you covered. And you could conceivably view that as a subscriber actually having a conversation with Manny, as a way to think about it, right?
Brilliant.
So, and so hopefully that answered your question on kind of how that would play out. And it's frankly, I tend to oversimplify how anything might be built, but the reality is doing what I just described is actually not that complicated. It takes some horsepower, it takes some architecting and engineering, but the reality is the data already exists. And if the data exists, structured or unstructured, these LLMs are really good at interacting with it. And so it's not that challenging to build a system that I just described.
That's brilliant. For a lot of tech companies, I do a lot of work with manufacturing companies. Manufacturing has been kind of in my blood. Design, test and measurement, both electrical, software, and even mechanical. And I can just imagine, some of the CEOs we speak to that are really against AI, they don't understand it, so they push it away. I'm sure if they would recognize how powerful that tool you just described would be by looking at their own archives, maybe if they have access to customer complaints or positive or negative reviews, maybe they've got user manuals or just, I'm sure they've got a lot of data that can be aggregated to produce that. The only question is what is proprietary, what's confidential, so that it have to be some smarts about how you put that in the repository.
Yeah, I mean, so I 100% believe that the security of your data, your company, your data, your effectively intellectual property is paramount in considering any AI solution. The good news is, and I think that while it's important, the fears around it are somewhat unfounded from a perspective of there are plenty of techniques, tools, and strategies to protect it. I mean, as simply put, as not allowing your data to be used for training, for instance, a foundational model like an LLM. I mean, it is literally a button you click. Don't use this. So it's a little more complicated that when you start to talk about how to actually, do policy management around your data. And then even further, if that data does include things like personally identifiable information or is regulated like HIPAA and other things. So there's a lot going on there, but maybe to put at least that concern to bed, there are ways to protect your data. And frankly, they're not that different than the way we would have protected that data under non-AI applications, right? So there are definitely ways to protect people, and I think, part of the thing that business leaders or executives or owners or founders need to think about is a little bit differently is how do I turn all that data into an asset? Now, I know that's a kind of a common strategy. There's plenty of consultancy around that, but I like to think about it as your data, your processes, frankly, your people are all part of your intellectual property. I mean, normally, if you think about, because you deal with this all the time from like an M&A perspective, those things usually fall into the know-how bucket of intellectual property. And, historically, there's not a great way to account for know-how. It's not like you can copyright it or patent it, so to speak. but it is most definitely intellectual property. And so the thing I like to try to encourage people is if you have a really a successful way of doing something, whether it's a business process, whether there's specific even calculations as an example that go into justifying a decision, something like maybe underwriting or other kind of other models that are used to serve your customers. You start looking at all these things that you do as a business, and if you can ascribe intellectual property or even just secret sauce to the way you're doing it, then that presents an opportunity for you to codify it in an application, right? So to build software and technology around it, what that in effect does is convert it from like an intangible know-how, like non-registered intellectual property, to registered intellectual property, because now it exists in an application, piece of software that you can ascribe a value to as an asset. So hopefully that I explained that well, but I think when people consider M&A, ultimately someone wants an exit for their business. I believe that in many cases there's a lot more value to companies than someone is actually paying for, but it's because no one can really ascribe a value to an asset that's unclear, that is chalked up to intangible and or know-how, and ultimately, think about it like goodwill. I mean, goodwill is a nebulous
Yeah, very
is a
nebulous.
nebulous number in M&A land. I mean, sometimes there's easy calculations to it, but in many cases, I guess my point is, I think people tend to be undervalued because there's no way for someone to fully appreciate the value of secret sauce.
Secret sauce, man, that is a definitely something that is not fully understood by a lot of business owners and executives. It's just something that this is the way we do things, right? And the one, I think the ones that do recognize it, they have a hard time ascribing a value to it. What's this worth? And then I like your idea, the concept here of how do you actually turn that into an app or a piece of software that people can use. So let's use an example just to bring it for more clarity. And I'm going to use a kind of a random, just out of my brain. Say there's a
Sure.
company that makes parts for overlanding, which is like off-road stuff, right? You
Mhm.
have rooftop tents, you've got lights, you've got different bars and everything on for your vehicle, and they're a manufacturer, and so they've been doing this for 30 years, and they want to sell. So you can think of they're selling the dies and the designs and all that, but there's still a lot of know-how that is not captured. And I think in particular, you see these apps where you can, like for rims or whatever, you can add rims on your vehicle and you can do that. So how would a company like that, and sky's the limit. So take your thinking, put your thinking hat on, and how could a company like that actually wrap their know-how into a piece of software?
Right. Actually, and hopefully this is a good response or kind of example of how someone might approach that. Now, one thing that people I think also tend to underestimate is tribal knowledge and how it fits in this. So not just the secret sauce of process and know-how, but people themselves. So what ends up happening if in a lot of companies is you have longstanding employees. Those employees have helped, in this particular case, as an example, sort out a lot of complicated problems on behalf of clients. So let's say, I've got a particular model of vehicle, and this part is no longer available. And if someone inside that company says, well, you know what? If you get this replacement part and this bracket, and you put these two things together, they'll make it work for that vehicle. Now, in a lot of cases, we see this all the time. The person who answered that question knows that information, but it's locked up here. It's not actually. I use the word codified. It's not documented in a way that anybody else is going to be able to access that. So from like thinking about it as a knowledge management platform. So one really great place to start for looking on how to leverage and convert, let's call it, this secret sauce about your business, might start with tribal knowledge. And there are techniques and ways and platforms and all sorts of tools that can be used in order to extract that tribal knowledge and document it so that it becomes now a part of at least a shared knowledge management platform or database. so that other people can access it. Now, AI could come in off the top of that and say, now I'm a less experienced person in the same position of servicing a customer, and could simply check, like, this guy's having a problem with this part fitting this vehicle, and see, like, oh, look, it was referenced by this other person that had the tribal knowledge. They recommended you should take this replacement part in that bracket, and it'll fit that scenario. So I think tribal knowledge is always a really great place to look. And then when we talk about then going a step further and then maybe building into an application. So the idea that you actually then now go more like customer or front facing or self-service with that notion, and really letting people that you service in this example know, we're known for helping you figure out how to get replacement parts to fit. Tell us about your vehicle. Tell us about the part you're having a problem with. So now that's actually in an application. Tell me tell me the make and model of the vehicle. Tell me the make and model of the part that you can't get. Tell me what replacement part you've identified, or maybe it's a recommendation. And then it kind of puts the puzzle pieces together for them and says, oh, if you want that to work with that vehicle, you need this bracket, right? So now that's an evolution of that, taking the tribal knowledge, first making it accessible to everybody in an organization, and then maybe on top of that, creating a selector, field. So you use drop downs that you are informing the app on, and now you've actually taken that tribal knowledge and built not just a reactive way to service clients, but a proactive way. Put it out there on your website, and advertise it as such. Like, we're our secret sauce. We're known for getting parts to fit, and help create a tool that helps those clients solve those problems on their own. And so hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I think that's a great. Yeah, it just got me thinking about how, at Spark Partners, we talk a lot about value and value delivery. If you look at Netflix, their value is they deliver entertainment. That's their value. Their value delivery is they first did it with DVDs, then they did it with streaming, then they did it with custom content, then they're going to be doing it with gaming, and peer-to-peer. And they have a whole tool chest of things they're exploring, but it's all under the umbrella of their value, which is delivering entertainment. And I think for that example, that random example of overlanding is, maybe that company can, their value is really enabling you to enjoy the outdoors, or enable you, get to the hardest places or whatever that. And then under that, you have to deliver your value in different ways. And I can just imagine it from an M&A perspective, you're selling your company for 20 million, and now you've got this amazing AI repository, box that interfaces with customers that says, hey, listen, tell me your vehicle and where you're going, and we're going to give you a really amazing picture of what that looks like. And you put in your, hey, I got a 2006 Jeep Cherokee black, whatever, and you put it into the chatbot thing, and then boom, it shows it lifted with cool rims, with lights, with a rooftop tent, with a winch, with a gas carrier, and then it can say, this is what you want. Put this, push this button, and you can order it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And now more than ever, even the creation of scenes around it, like you were suggesting, that's all frankly possible with everything you just described is possible now if someone wanted to build it. And so, put that Cherokee on the side of a mountain, crawling in super low gear, going up a 45-degree slope with, a lake in the back.
Yeah, that's crazy, man. And then you look in the future of something like VR, virtual reality or augmented reality, then you can start to see how that starts to amplify. Give us some more context of where you have seen this sort of thing successful, and where it's added. If you have your own example for where a company has grown their value tremendously by implementing their own version of an app.
Sure. Yeah. So one thing is that, and this is sometimes a great test of frankly, any, as an investor, any in investment under consideration, a lot of really great use cases and good ideas are actually boring ones, right? And we often talk to our clients about, like, innovation is innovation regardless if it's a moonshot or if it's just incremental, small chunks, because a lot of incremental small chunks add up to larger results. And so while we have had clients working on what I'll call sophisticated, novel, like net new, like maybe an application where something like literally could not have been done until AI unlocked that value. What a lot of people are really trying to figure out is how do they just make what they do today better?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways in which is, I think, and I'd mentioned, you don't talk technology first, you talk business and business process and stakeholders first, is starting through the analysis of your existing process. So if you look at something like something as simple as book to cash, you map that entire thing out. You start assigning like what the process looks like today and who the stakeholders are. And by the way, including those people in the conversation, right? Because a lot of really great incremental innovation comes from boots on the ground, frontline workers, people that are actually, you know, the practitioner or of the process, not necessarily the one overseeing it, but the ones actually, you know, living and breathing it, right? So some of those small suggestions can be powerful examples of where technology can fit. But it's important to recognize that you need to look at your process first, because sometimes you have to make room in your process for the insertion of the technology. It may not easily fit the way a process exists today. But then when you start assigning KPIs and goals to the process, so now we say, okay, we understand what a process looks like, book to cash. Well, a really probably obvious metric to that is I want to speed it up. So then you start looking for all the examples of challenges to increasing that acceleration of book to cash. And then you start looking at first, because we talked about this earlier in this discussion, is sometimes that's actually just an automation. It may not necessarily be AI, but where AI might fit is, as an example, and this is a fairly common one, I think, in most cases, is does this document meet? So let's say in the process a document is necessary to fill out, whatever the fields are, it doesn't really matter. But let's say now I need to know, was this document completed correctly? Does it pass, let's say, an internal SOP that we have written around the completion of this document? Does it pass for instance, if it's under a regulated space, let's say like insurance as an example, does it pass the test of compliance related to what's in this document? Now you start to look at all the ways in which some oversight might be necessary to demonstrate that document was done correctly. You have multiple independent checkpoints, possibly multiple stakeholders that have to consider those checkpoints for, let's say, this document to be completed or to be considered completed and done correctly. Well, AI can do that for you. So of the three kind of buckets I mentioned, so, you know, even as simple as were all the fields completed, and then, oh, by the way, this is a client in my CRM, so I'm going to check all the fields for the database I already have on the client, make sure that they're actually consistent with what I know about my client, right? So simple stuff. There's the kind of the demographic, but even firmographic stuff that you might relate to a client to make sure it passes that test. And then second, you know, did I complete all the necessary steps? So we could go out and look for, yes, you know, in order for this document to be registered, we also need to check whether a customer is current on their payment terms, as an example. Or do they have, you know, they're trying to place a big order. It could check history against, is this anomalous? Like what they're, you know, the information we're seeing now, is it anomalous related to our understanding of that client's history, their purchase history, and other things of it. And then there's the third, which let's say it's for medical supplies or supplements or something like that. Does it pass the regulatory test, right? So do they have all of their regulations? Do we have all of their, let's say, documents on file that are current for, you know, something that might be related to timing or expiration? And it's actually doing all these tests for you. And maybe on top of that, and this is where I think the newer features of what generative AI can specifically do is it can also then make recommendations for what it sees as being not compliant, which is just as important. Today, that process might be reject it, send it back to, you know, the originator, and, you know, maybe someone typed in some hand notes like, hey, this part of this thing needs to be reviewed and possibly revised. Well, what the AI can do in this case is It can not only document or identify all of, let's say, the anomalies in this process of checking this thing across, all these different considerations, but it could also recommend how to fix it. Um, so, I think if you, while the example I gave you, this is not like some novel, earth-shattering, like kind of academic view of the implementation in AI. This is very practical use cases, and the one I gave, usually these features fit into two buckets: efficiency or enrichment. So in this case, clearly efficiency. On the enrichment side of things, you if you think about the amount of touch points you have with clients, and and frankly the increasing amount of kind of content or need for access to information, I always mess up the number, but I think it was Asana, the project management tool, published a study that said something crazy like 65% of an average worker's time is spent searching for information, asking for information, and worst case scenario, recreating information that already existed.
Wow.
And so, that might point to an example of efficiency, but more importantly, there's also a notion of enrichment that's involved here. So when you ask AI, for instance, like I'm going to have a QBR with a client, and you want it to generate a report that gives you a lot of great background information, probably something on, got a templated list of like things you'll go through with a QBR with a client. It's going to talk about successes, going to talk about failures, going to talk about new things coming up. But the generative AI can create that entire report for you if you give it the rules. Like you have to have a rules engine, of course. But it can do it in ways that, as an example, if your QBR has a like an executive
What's a QBR
stakeholder.
for our listeners? They may not know what that is.
Oh, sorry, like a quarterly business review.
Okay.
Right. So let's say in that room that you got to go present, you've got a business owner or an executive. Maybe you've got a manager. Maybe there's your kind of primary interface, which may be more related to a business function, if it's like sales or manufacturing. So you got multiple stakeholders in the room. Well, not only can it create this report, but it can actually customize the report knowing who each of the stakeholders are. So an executive might want to know something different than the manager versus the liaison, right? The boots on the ground liaison you work with in a particular function. It can create one for each of them just by knowing who they are, what their role is, even, if you want to enrich it further, their skills, the things they like, don't like. I mean, it can actually customize that. So, that's where I think when I say they fall into usually two buckets, efficiency and enrichment, that would be an example of enrichment. That same report, not only can it be automated, but it can be customized. And so the person delivering it's not only saving time, but he's also presenting the data in a way that is more appropriate to the person he's presenting it to. And that's a function of enrichment. So, there's loads of obviously use cases we could probably float through. Hopefully that was a decent enough.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I think for as we round out the podcast here, the possibilities for all levels of business are just enormous. Both you mentioned boots on the ground, supply chain, legal, strategy. I think there could be outward facing tools like we discussed with the Overland project, or inward facing tools like you just described in this enrichment example. And I think the business owners and executives that are smart to begin to test and recognize this are going to be the ones that are going to be leading the pack. And with that, I'd like for you to share with our audience how they can get in touch with you. And then I'm also going to have you kind of give some of your most, I wouldn't say advice, but what are the big picture things that an executive should be doing right now in looking at their own value?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll start by saying, so the company's name is SteadyDynamic. We're based in Phoenix, Arizona. Our website is www.steadynamic.com. It's all one word, steady, dynamic, combined to a portmanteau. So steadynamic.com. Obviously we'd be we'd be happy to have conversations with people who are kind of contemplating this subject and help them sort through, because it is definitely not an easy task. I do this for a living. I do it every day. And I will tell you, not anybody who claims they're experts on it, they might be for about 24 hours until it all changes again.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yep,
but
I get it.
like I said, most important thing is really figure out, without technology being the first part of the conversation, what are you trying to achieve? And then we start talking about the possible, start talking about requirements and how we're going to help you meet your objectives. I think one, people talk a lot about a fear, maybe to some degree even a rational fear about displacement, AI being a worker displacement. But I would make a counter argument, which is that the projections for the amount of unfilled positions in the United States by 2030 is dramatic. It's something like 3.6 million jobs. There will not be people to fill them. So I would flip the argument around and say, don't look at this as and enlarge as a way that's going to replace employees due to these inefficiencies. It's going to fill the roles of jobs that there is no one to fill. And so if from a founder or a CEO or an owner perspective, I'd encourage to use that thought process on, there's highly skilled workers you want to keep in their position because they do a good job and they're helping you meet your objectives. But there are not going to be enough people to fill all the jobs we have open soon. And so you start to look at where your human employees are adding value and double down on making them the best they possibly can for that purpose. And then taking a look at these other areas that are going to get harder and harder to fill. And that's a good area to focus on: automation, AI, technology, and software, to help account for the fact that it's not getting rid of people. It's doing the job of people you can't hire. They don't exist.
That's a pretty amazing concept, and I agree with you 100%. Brandon, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to bringing you on in the future to see how things have progressed with your company and what you're doing. And with that, we'll talk to you some other time.
All right. Thanks for having me, Manny. Enjoyed it.
Cheers.